Good.
Okay, great. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our Tuesday night meeting for the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. It is the fourth Tuesday of the month, which means that this is our fight against data-driven policing. And we welcome folks tonight. And so this week we are going to be continuing a conversation that we started numerous weeks ago. And this is a continued discussion of our recently released report called Automating Banishment, that we have been like breaking down into sections and discussing with folks for further analysis and sharing and conversation. And we're excited to be continuing that tonight. The coalition does have additional fights in addition to the fight against predictive and data-driven policing. If folks are interested in getting involved with those, I'll just list what a few of those are. So on the first Tuesday of the month, we have a meeting around gender and sexuality and how folks are policed and surveilled through that lens as well. On the second Tuesday, we have a fight against the war on youth. And on the third Tuesday, that is our general coalition meeting. Yes, I got that right. Our general coalition meeting, and folks are free to join any of those with us. So for this meeting, I'll be facilitating along with my comrade Sabrina, who I will be passing to shortly. My name is Tiff. I use they and them pronouns, and just briefly a bit more about myself is that I joined the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition in 2016. I met Hamid at that time and met Jamie and additional folks shortly after in the meetings there, and have been involved with the various fights since that time. Got involved with the fight against predictive policing in 2017 and have been a part of that fight specifically since that time, and have been really excited to be building with folks in that and to be talking about that a bit more tonight, just that fight that we're involved in and what we've been learning. So please do go ahead and drop your name in the chat. As I see folks have been doing, I'm just taking a look at the chat now. And so that's great. And please do, as we're going through the conversation, use the chat as a way to, like if you want to do stack to make a comment or post a question, comment, anything, please do put it in there, and we'll try to be keeping eyes on that. And thanks folks for saying hi in there. Okay, and before we get into the section about the report, we just did want to first ground in our principles of community organizing and self-defense. So as abolitionists and organizers and community members, we do come together around a certain set of principles that we organize around. And you can find those on the website for the coalition. And I'm going to pass it to Nee to share that with folks, and also just to be looking at one of those. We try to start each of our meetings by looking at one of those. So I'm going to pass that over to Nee to do now. Thank you.
Perfect. And Hamid, can you make me perfect. Okay. Hey y'all, my name's Nee. It's good to see y'all and share space. I'm going to share with y'all one of our principles that we have, and it's you can find it as well. So there are QR codes on the side. So if you would take a photo of it, it'll also send you to the link, but you can find it at stoplapdspying.com under zines, under the statements of principles. But the statement of principles are some of our grounding principles that we have for how we would want to navigate those spaces, just knowing that we are a coalition, and so making sure that we are grounding ourselves. And so the principle that we want to highlight specific for this week is the operational unity among collaborating groups. We are committed to working together and creating affinity groups that share principles and concerns to create a more common front in defending our communities. And as Tiff had mentioned, it's also, for example, the Automating Banishment, the report that we're going to be looking at right now, which grew from the Data-Driven Policing Working Group, as well as several of our other working groups as well. But we ground ourselves in these principles I would highly recommend, if you haven't taken a look at the zine, to go into the website, or once again, you can also scan the QR code, which is here on the sides, and it'll also take you directly to that link. And I'll pass it back to Tiff for the next portion.
Great, thank you so much. All right, folks. So yeah, so now we will just talk a little bit more about, just remind folks of what the report is about, and just get us caught up to speed on what we covered so far in sections 1 and section 2 of the report. And as a reminder, so tonight we're continuing to talk about section 2, and I'll let Sabrina get to that part. So first, I'll just say that, like, regarding the report itself, Automating Banishment, this is a continuation of the work that we did together to expose predictive policing in Los Angeles. And it builds on our 2018 report, Before the Bullet Hits the Body. That was something that we exposed these predictive policing systems. And with this report, we look more deeply at the way that those programs were being used, in terms of, like, what were the specific locations they were targeting, what were the ways that they were targeting folks, but also putting this into the larger context of understanding how this was happening, how this has been a part of history, and how this is a continuation of history, how this is linked to the ongoing conquest of land and the attainment of capital. So kind of linking it to that larger history of settler colonialism, and also understanding police to be an occupying force and the means by which that land is taken and that capital is built, and those that people are removed from land. So kind of putting it in all of that context as well, and understanding data-driven policing as an extension, a continuation of that history. So folks can find that report online at automatingbanishment.org. There is our full length report online there. There's also a shorter summary which captures all of the main points really beautifully. And we're going to continue having these conversations every 2 weeks. We're going to be talking a little bit more about the report. If folks want to catch up on what we've covered so far, you can go to our website, and we will have our study guides there just for each section. And you can also review the previous conversations that we've had. So I'm going to hand it over to Sabrina in just a second, but I'll just pause and see if we have any questions or comments on any of that so far. Okay, I think Sabrina, you can go ahead and get us caught up.
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. Welcome. I know that was a lot of information. So I just kind of want to start our conversation with maybe a brief overview of section 1 and 2. So in our first meeting, and which covered section 1 in the report, it's really just kind of discussing the historical context of policing in the LA area. So we kind of go back in time and we discuss the displacement of the indigenous peoples. We're providing some examples of the ongoing displacement and gentrification over time across various neighborhoods around LA. And we do start to touch on how police play a huge role in enforcing a lot of those colonialist practices. And then our last discussion a couple weeks ago, it was the beginning of section 2, where we were kind of discussing the history of data-driven policing and how it led to the development of LASER. So data-driven policing essentially came about during a wave of reforms. And so we discussed how the Reformation process really kind of expanded the policing power and surveillance methods. And kind of compared a little bit to how that reflects what's going on today as well. Right, so LASER is a data-driven program which uses collected data to create areas for increased surveillance. So we continue to discuss some of the methods in which LASER did that. And then we continue to discuss some of the harms caused when people and locations are criminalized. And we had a lot of great conversation about how people have been personally affected. And so if anyone is interested in hearing some of that conversation, you can go back and watch the recordings from section 2, for the first part of section 2 a couple weeks ago. And then for our first discussion point of today, we did want to start with a prompt, essentially, before getting into the report itself. we wanted to discuss a little bit of how data is political. Does anybody want to like jump in and kind of give some perspective on like what that means to them?
I can kick it off. Yeah, so when I hear data is political, I guess to me that's a statement that runs contrary to the notion that data is somehow benign or impartial or innocuous or just something that can be amassed without any harm being done.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. So kind of to continue building on that, data is created and collected by people, right? And we can use data to kind of inform our own perspectives, right? So data, it isn't quite as neutral as we want to think it is, because it can be used and manipulated to support specific perspectives. And so it's kind of a really core critique throughout the report, but also something that we should just kind of keep in mind when we're reading a lot of the stats and data and stuff that we're seeing, especially when we know that the police are trying to use it to weaponize and continue to justify their surveillance and the harms that they're doing. So data does carry social and political consequences depending on how it's used.
Yeah, and I think Shakir has their hand up. I think, right?
Yeah, thanks, Tiff and Sabrina. Yeah, one thing I was gonna share actually is a quote that a couple people have heard me quote a bunch of times because I've been doing a lot, is from the grandmother of someone who we met with after, Mary Williams, the grandmother of Keith Bursey, who was one of the people who was killed in one of these LAPD laser zones, these kill zones that were like kind of data driven locate hotspots that police would target for extreme surveillance and monitoring and they said they picked these locations based on data. And a couple months ago we met with the grandmother of one of the young men who was killed in one of these zones near the Crenshaw Mall, Mary Williams, and we had a conversation with her about like what's her perspective on this idea that the data that is fed into these systems is like what Matios was saying, this idea that the data is impartial or objective or something like that. And she articulated it, she like just pinpointed in a way that I think perfectly answers the question, which is she goes, written down that the computer doesn't just go out and pick up the data, it's police that put data, it's police that put data into the computer. The racism and the injustice comes from a person. So just as we were saying here, like the people who are doing it, either generating that data or literally the ones using that data, the police, they're going to always have their racism, their logic of who they're looking for and their relationship to land, their relationship to people, their relationship to their political kind of role. And so it doesn't like there's like that's whose data it is.
Yeah, and that's such a great quote to really kind of put it into perspective, and how the data can be manipulated from a very early point in the process, right? And how it can kind of create that feedback loop where police collect the data from the neighborhoods they're surveilling and then use that data to justify further surveillance, right? And so this is the ways in which data is political, where it's not just benign, where it's not neutral, and it has actual social and political consequences, and very much affecting people's lives.
Yeah, and just thinking about like how there's so many different ways that bias gets picked up. So like whether it's, just you can say, oh, we're going to create a survey and we're going to, be asking just getting information and asking questions, but it's like, what are the questions that you're asking? Who are you asking? What is your intention? So it's just every step of that along the way, there is going to be bias as a part of that. And so, yeah, so just thinking about that as well.
And we know that the programs, PredPol specifically used old crime reports, which have already been proven to have been extremely biased and racially discriminatory. So how can they justify using all of that data to inform their current practices when we already know it was problematic to begin with.
Yeah, any other thoughts from folks on that, just that term data, what do we mean when we say data is political? And I see a comment in the chat. And Shakir saying all the data harvested by these systems is just from surveillance, arrests, racial profiling. And Steve is saying, this is the foxes watching the hen house, police, academia, etc. control the acquisition and interpretation of this so-called data and use it to oppress. None of it is quality of life. Its focus is on the arbitrary definition of crime. Yeah, thank you for that. Any other thoughts or comments from folks? Okay, we can get moving into, and please let me know if I do miss a hand or a question, but otherwise I think we'll go ahead and start talking about, I see an additional comment here. Many people see data as objective and factual. They refuse to see the true political nature of data. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, and very much so. And that, of course, is the core point of LAPD saying that they're using data, right? They're trying to justify it. They're trying to neutralize. They're trying to act like their biases aren't infused into it. Yeah, and exactly as Hamid continues to say, data and information collection is always weaponized for social control.
Yeah, so we can talk a little bit, what we can do next is talk a little bit more about the specific the main predictive policing programs that we do talk about in the report, and that aspects of them are still continued today. Thank you folks for continuing to use the chat to say hi and introduce yourselves, and please continue to do that. So the main policing programs that we do focus on and that we focused on in our fight were Operation Laser and Predpol. And both of these were predictive policing programs that were developed here in Los Angeles by supposed academics in collaboration with police or supposed researchers. Both of these were predictive policing programs that use either an algorithm or a risk assessment or some kind of like so-called scientific modeling tool plus crime data to make designations or assumptions about which locations and which people are going to be most criminal. So that's what Operation and Predpol were, and these were two separate programs. And just some of the things to note about these are that these were very much experimental. Operation Laser came from, it was funded from a grant from the government, from the Department of Justice. And this was essentially, the grant was created to be offered to police departments that were willing to experiment with predictive policing. So this was grant money that was given to them to experiment with predictive policing here in Los Angeles. And so they took advantage of that funding. These programs were very dehumanizing. LASER stood for Los Angeles Strategic Extraction and Restoration. And the premise, welcome Pancake. And the premise of this was that police were, that police would use they would use this data information to target locations and people that they deemed to be potentially most criminal with laser-like precision, and that they would extract them from the community. And they called it a medical analogy in which people were tumors to be extracted. So that was part of the premise of Operation Laser. So obviously, when you hear that this is the way that they are talking about community, this is the way it was presented to get the grant money, the way the program was rolled out, referring to people in this manner, it's just extremely dehumanizing, and also just fails to take into consideration all of the ways that you can't just, even if police had that laser-like precision and that was a real thing, like extracting a person from a community is not like people have these connections and have relationships and community. So yeah, essentially that this is not something that can be done unless you're extremely dehumanizing about a person. So just wanted to pause there for a moment and see if there are any reactions to this, or just the way that they're referring to folks with this type of, or what, I guess, just what are the implications when you hear that these are the types of programs that are getting funding at the governmental level and are being able to be experimented on community? Just see if folks have any thoughts on that. Okay, Hamid, did you?
Yeah, just a real quick comment that, there's a long history. I mean, but that's one of our guiding values as well, not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. So the LAPD has always officially documented dehumanization of people in so many different ways. I mean, at least in the 70s or 80s, I don't know if folks back then or have read about it, that they would commonly refer to particularly residents of South Central Los Angeles, Black community members, in their filing of reports as no humans involved. So NHI was the acronym they would use in their official documentation. So I think this whole dehumanization and degradation of human life has been such a common theme in how they have weaved constantly. So, and there are various other terminologies like, that they use. So, but this is really the official documentation of their policing that has been a common theme throughout.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hamid. And I see a few comments in the chat here as well. Isaiah says similar to how the LAPD would use NHI. I'm not actually familiar with that. Is that something that you would like to comment on, Isaiah? No human involved. Yes, I am familiar with that. Okay. And I'm not sure if you'd like to comment anyway, Isaiah. Please do if you would like. And then Ushnish says the medical laser surgery analogy makes it sound more palatable, acceptable to more people. Yeah. And Steve says the foundation used remarks. I lost the comment.
Steve
Okay.
is saying the foundation used remains othering and a zero-sum game.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so and we see that so that was Operation Laser, and we see that kind of a similar thing was happening with Predpol. And what Predpol was an algorithm. This was a type of predictive policing that was different and separate from Operation Laser. Predpol was an algorithm and also a company that was created to sell that algorithm. Predpol was, it focused on property crime, predicting supposedly property crime. And it was developed by a group of academics, including anthropologist Jeff Brantingham at UCLA. And Brantingham looked at crime through the lens of like human behavior and evolution, and even asserted that criminals are essentially foragers, and that choosing which car to steal is like choosing which animal to hunt. The same decision making goes into both of these choices. So kind of no acknowledgement of race or other conditions that people face on a daily basis, but kind of looking at it through this lens of like human behavior and evolution. So again, we see how this pseudoscience is used to, and this intellectual framework is used to dehumanize folks and to create this framework of the other and a criminalization of the other, and to also use that intellectual framework to get funding and to and also to get this this research published. Notably, PredPol was also developed based on research that was done, funded by the military. It was research that was done for, I believe, the military, and it was to predict insurgency in the Middle East. Am I getting that correct, Hamid? It wasn't the same algorithm, but it was that was the foundation of where that algorithm developed. Okay. Yeah, so basically, Brantingham was kind of developing it over there, funded by the military. And then I think it was both LAPD and definitely Brantingham who saw like, oh, this is something that can be used in some capacity to predict crime here in Los Angeles. And so this is just one example of many of a tactic that was developed for warfare internationally and then imported here to be used domestically as well. So again, I'll just pause for a moment and see if folks have comments on that. And yeah, Jeffrey Brantingham is pretty well known, I think, to a number of folks here. And we've also done some organizing with folks at UCLA and have been building with folks there. But I'll just pause and see if folks have questions about that or any thoughts on, again, these types of premises are the basis for these policing programs. And Hannah, I believe your hand is up.
Oh, sorry. Hi. Yeah, I think my reactions are just like, it's so infuriating, like how dehumanizing like the tactics are, and just having this like whole image of serve and protect alongside of like the dehumanization. It feels like it's like this lack of transparency, like in this like public image way, but then also in the language, you like see the dehumanizing language of like treating people as like objects to like extract from a place and from a home and a community. And so I just feel like kind of like this weird, like just like disturbing, like lack of transparency about what they're doing, but also you can see it in their written words and like the impact and everything. And it's disgusting.
Yeah, and I'll also ask, like, how do folks feel about, I'm just thinking about like as we've been learning about, the basis of these programs and some of these assumptions that are made about folks, it's sometimes surreal when you just hear how, like the fact that PredPol is based on, it's an part of the algorithm includes a predictor for seismology for earthquakes. So it takes crime data and pairs it with an algorithm that predicts where an earthquake, where the aftershocks or the after effects are going to be. And just that is, like, as we talked about that with folks at LA Can, I remember just, folks being amazed that this is something that would be funded, or that would be a program that would be launched at all, because we understand, like, and again, something that, like, Hamid, I remember you being on panels with some of the folks that worked on creating this algorithm, and they would try to keep people out of the conversation by saying, oh, it's very complex, these are mathematical equations, trying to make this assumption that folks wouldn't understand, when really, just at a very foundational level, it is obviously something that folks do understand. And also, if they're not able to talk about this or explain it, then that is something that is a problem. It shows that they are actually out of touch with what they're devising and what they're doing. So I don't know if folks have any thoughts on that. Thank you, Hamid. So is that the name of the, like the algorithm or the, what that sequence was?
Yes, this was the earthquake predictor, where the basic, and of course I'm not a scientist, but it wasn't that difficult to read through this bullshit and pseudoscience of that that if there's an earthquake, then it has these extended ripple effects like aftershocks. So kind of using you know, just this aftershock model of crime, that it can be predicted in that. So it's really a whole lot of pseudoscience here.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Okay, and then we just have a couple more questions. So, and something else I just wanted to share was that something that the coalition has talked about as well is how this is a continuation, like this type of technology is a continuation of policing that has always existed, and how PredPol actually, the PredPol algorithm actually mimics redlining in that it creates these borders that are defining areas where some folks are protected and allowed to live and exist, while other community members are banished from the area or kept from the area. And I just thought that was a really great point for us to consider as well. A few more questions for us to consider if folks have thoughts on them. One of the things is, like when we're talking about, again, like what is the premise that we're basing this on? PredPol essentially relied on the assertion, as do the policing programs that exist now, is that we know that crime is concentrated. So this is something that was asserted by the creators of PredPol. And they said, well, we know that crime is concentrated in certain spots. And my question for folks is, what does that, like, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that right from that very first assumption? Like, if that's our basis.
If I can just jump in, like, I think that means that, like, historically, police have been stationed in neighborhoods of color to document these ideas of crimes, but we have no actual evidence that any of these things happened. And so we're believing a historically racist institution in their documentation. And so when we say that this assumption that crime, quote unquote, is located or concentrated in certain areas, we're relying on records that we know are historically racist and have that intention. And so, like, it's so convoluted. It just, like, actually makes my head want to explode.
Yeah, those are great points. Yeah, and Ushni says white collar crimes not included. Yeah, that's a great point. It's like when they say we know there are concentrations of crime, and it's like, well, who is collecting that crime data? Who, what do you define as crime? Like, who's defining the crime? Who's gathering that information? Who's keeping those reports? Who's classifying them? Like, there's just these different layers of questions, but you're saying it as if this is an assertion that everybody knows. So, and again, these are, you know, that's the basics of hotspot policing, which is something that is continued today. She says data was collected where people thought there would be crime, more police presence, more stops, more tickets, etc., in particular areas. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's really more something that folks say is it's really more indicative, like crime reports is indicative of, I mean, it's indicative of who is being, like, a report was made is essentially what it's saying. And so this can be indicative of police behavior, of additional surveillance in an area. And then additional comments, also white collar crimes are more impactful and expensive to communities. And who's controlling the data, who's naming the data, what is being identified as crime. Yeah. And then, yeah, those are great points. Thank you. And then just kind of a similar question in terms of Operation Laser. And then we'll go ahead and take a look at a paragraph that is from the report that's talking a little bit more about, we're going to be talking a little bit more about like how people were targeted. But a question for Operation Laser around that was like that Laser, which made predictions about locations and people that were supposedly most criminal or most likely to be involved with crime. It justified the collection of data and the labeling of a person's traits or features or where they lived as being criminal. And one of the things it did was it assumed criminality by looking at a record of a person's interactions with police, like their historical interactions with police. And that was the basis by which criminality was assumed and assigned. And so my question for folks is what is the problem with looking at a person's, either if you want to call it their criminal record or just their record of interactions with police or involvement with the so-called criminal justice system? Like if that is your basis of making judgments about a person, what is the problem with that? And if folks don't have any thoughts on that, we can also take a look at a section from the text where we kind of talk about this a little bit more. Nee, are you able to share I think it's the second quote that we have.
Also, Ty asked us to repeat the question. So what Tiff was asking was just, what is the problem with looking at someone's like criminal record or their history or their location or their features as a way of making judgments about them, especially how it justifies the type of data that's being collected to justify further surveillance.
And perhaps like who is going to be most impacted by that, if that's the way we are deciding who is criminal. Okay, Ty, I see your hand is up.
I would just say who's determined criminal by the state is very much relative to their made up rules, and then they make up these rules and have people with criminal records, and then it just becomes a cycle of then policing them more and then them having longer criminal records because of that, and etc. So I think that's why it's most harmful, because it's their rules and what they make up, and then it's at their whims for the communities that are affected, because they are intentional with the communities that they affect. So
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and that's a good way of saying it, is that in terms of them making it up, because it really is that they are making this up. And then also, as we found when the audit was conducted, that they're not even following these own rules that they set or that they present. Yeah, thank you for that. And Nee, can you take it to the next slide? Actually, I think we'll take a look at the person-based policing. Thank you. Do we have anyone who would like to read that out for us out loud?
Yeah, I'll read it. This is Mr. Pancake.
Go ahead.
Was a little late because I was on another Zoom. Okay, it reads as follows. In a person-based policing, in addition to the location-based aspects noted above, LAPD's data-driven programs also include person-based targeting. True to the term extraction in the LASER acronym, the program used data mining to target individuals for banishment. Even though LAPD claimed to use a point system to standardize this process, a 2019 audit by the Office of the Inspector General uncovered that 112 of 637 people who were in the chronic offender database at the time had 0 points under the LAPD criteria, person-based policing.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Pancake. Yeah, so what this is talking about is that this was an aspect of Operation Laser. This was the person-based policing aspect where they would actually, where they claimed to take a look at all of these aspects about a person and then assign points to them based on things that they deemed to be most criminal. And then again, this was kind of what they presented, which is problematic in itself. But then when the program was audited, it was further found that these were not even being followed and that people were basically being assigned to this database or being assigned to this list of so-called chronic offenders without even any background being done on them or any points being assigned. It was basically seemingly at the whim of the local cops in the area is what was happening and how people were being targeted, which is obviously extremely devastating. And of course, something that is not unique to Operation Laser. It is something that exists in different forms. And I just wanted to also make space to see, like when we were organizing against Operation Laser, when the program was still going on, there were folks that we were building with and talking with, and where I'm going is Nee was one of the folks who organized together with the coalition to be talking more about the fact that this program existed and how people are being targeted and how areas are being targeted. And Nee, I'm wondering if you're able to just share a little bit about perhaps what your experience was like, perhaps maybe just learning more about this program or what that meant for you.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Tiff. Yeah, so as like Tiff had mentioned, back in, I want to say it was 2018, around 2018, 2019, in December, but we had organized several different workshops in collaboration with the OVAs, which are a autonomous group in Boyle Heights. We organized a series of Luna rides as well as like a teach the teacher, like teach the trainer, as well as being able to do outreach in the areas that were designated laser zones and anchor points. What we noticed when we had the Luna ride, it was one of the stops that we had was, well, two of the stops that we had for that Luna ride was one of the areas where Jesse Romero had been killed and targeted by LAPD, as well as a marketplace that was lasers, what is it, a laser zone as well, and notifying the folks in the community that that more resources were being placed in these areas, which meant that there was going to be an increased LAPD presence, including more stops, as well as more folks potentially catching cases as well, just because LAPD had arbitrarily decided to police these areas a lot more. And so part of it was just passing out flyers and letting folks in the community know that some of the places that were designated were folks were just buying groceries or folks were at a park, that all of those were targeted areas, which was a really dope way of like both utilizing your bikes as well as being able to pass out a lot of those information. But even in also, as we've also have reached out to folks on the chronic offenders list as well, one thing that constantly is talked about is how folks weren't aware that they were on this list. And it wasn't until like the coalition started to reach out to folks that they kind of started, well, they were aware that they were on this list, as well as like the information that LAPD had been generating, which included what looked like a hit list or a most wanted list. And what was interesting of that, it also, there was a section of it too that talks about the like Cal gangs as well. And so like we like the lineage as well of like what isn't considered acceptable gets adopted into more or reformed programs as well. And so that ongoing history of them trying to use like shady ways to continue those same programs under different names, just adapting or changing some of the language and protocols in place, which was interesting in kind of talking about that. But yeah, it resulted in folks not only also being targeted, folks catching cases, but also the deportation pipeline as well that exists from that and from just being generated on this list.
Yeah, thank you for that update, Nee. And I think that's work that continues, right, in terms of continuing to reach out to folks who may have been targeted as a result of the coalition demanding information from LAPD and winning a lawsuit against LAPD to release the records of folks who had been targeted and who were deemed to be chronic offenders and were part of this database. We did get close to 700 records, I believe, of folks. But also just want to be clear that we will probably never know what that true total was of folks, because there were like some divisions that we didn't receive any records from at all. So, and there are folks that, you know, that have been killed by police that may have been on that list, and we have no way of knowing. So it's just like, I think just to underscore that, that true impact will never be known, but it is something that we're continuing to look into with folks. Yeah, thank you for that. And so just one more point to make on this, and then we'll move into talking about crime prevention through environmental design, which is another program that LAPD did. But so just thinking about like Operation Laser and PredPol, it's very much you know, to do with academic complicity. So both of these predictive policing programs relied very heavily on the participation and the complicitness and the resources of academia. So just in terms of thinking about the complicity of academia, what is, I guess, what is the impact on the community when, and I'm thinking that we perhaps have some academics in the group with us, or folks that have connections to that world. But like, what is the impact on community when academics make that decision to work with police? Yeah, Hannah says it's negative. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but yeah, it is.
There's a hand up there. I believe it's Shakir.
Legitimizing. Yeah, I see. Monta says legitimizing. Yeah, and Shakir, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was gonna say, because especially trying to think of, and I'm glad Mamta just said legitimizing, because it's like the academic complicity sometimes takes a form beyond, there's academics who literally are making a decision sometimes to, okay, I'm going to develop a tool, I'm going to design a weapon, I'm going to write an algorithm or something that police are going to use. I'm like, and that's like, you know, the form of complicity that's really, really direct of literally, you know, arming the police. But then, and we see this even throughout all of these examples of data-driven policing and predictive policing, there's also other kind of forms that complicity can sometimes take that isn't as direct, like even just kind of participating in doing evaluations of LAPD systems and you know, presenting, you know, helping promote their programs or evaluate and vet them in that way. You know, again, working primarily with police data and police expertise and police accounts and just repackaging that, or even just research that just supports this kind of notion that policing and surveillance are responsible for safety, and or even that, you know, policing is something that we can fix with, like, you know, if we just try to clean up the data, or, you know, hire a more diverse police force, or whatever kinds of things. Those are ideas that academics are often pushing that, you know, might not be a matter of like directly kind of working with the police, but helps, you know, justify and expand and reform policing.
Yeah, thank you for that, Shakir. Additional thoughts or questions? Mamta?
Yeah, in that same vein, I guess, you know, just thinking about the risk assessment tools and the pretrial release algorithms, they're really sort of legitimized not just by the development of these tools by academics, but also by giving this false sort of sense of you know, peer review and accountability and monitoring. That's an ongoing enterprise for a lot of the sort of nonprofits and the academics in them. And then, of course, in universities and institutions that sort of look at, are constantly evaluating data and giving this sense that, look, this is all vetted. And I think that's along the lines of what Shakir just said as well. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that as well. Additional thoughts or comments? And I believe that's Claire Simonch. I'm not saying your name correctly. Go ahead. I think we had someone that just raised their hand. And also comment academics also help co-opt radical language into reformism.
I'm sorry, this is Claire. I think I was muted. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Claire Simonich, and I'm a lawyer, and I was a public defender until very recently. And just sort of to add to how the academic legitimizing plays out in the courts, like, I think a lot of judges and lawyers don't understand science because they're lawyers and they did humanities. And so then they feel really intimidated anytime somebody says science or academics or this was looked at by professors. And that's kind of the end of the story. Like, nobody questions the data beyond that because lawyers and judges don't have the training and are just generally like intimidated by that stuff. So it's almost like it's the last word once an academic signs off on something.
Yeah, that is so interesting, isn't it? Because I'm sure there's many of us here who have, felt that, you know, that same intimidation, and then you realize at some point that it's like a veneer of bullshit that, like, yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that comment. Yeah, it's great. That's why it's been like, it has been such a great process working with the coalition to be like really like diving in and like, you know, when you hear about a program or like just the premise of something that's being proposed, to be like, okay, what are they actually talking about? Like what is actually going on? And, you know, getting behind this language that they use to try to keep people out. So that's definitely been something that I very much learned with the coalition. Okay. And then I'll just finish this one off with, there's a last question. And this was a question that Mamta asked that I thought was just a really great question that may just take some pondering. How does colonialism experiment with new forms of violence? And how do perpetual wars abroad feed the perpetual war within the borders? And I think that's a really great question. I'll say it again. How does colonialism experiment with new forms of violence? And how do perpetual wars abroad feed the perpetual war within the borders? So I don't know if folks have any thoughts on that. I mean, what this brings up for me, and I think why we put this in this section, and Mamta, I'm not sure if you can talk anymore about what you were thinking about when you came up with this question, but like, how does colonialism experiment with new forms of violence? I'm thinking about Jeffrey Brantingham or whoever. It doesn't even have to be Jeffrey Brantingham, but literally experimenting using data that is taken from insurgents in the Middle East and coming up with an algorithm for predicting their behavior that is then used and sold here in the United States and sold to police departments to justify the criminalization of people here. So, and you know, just that ongoing experiment is something that it's making me think of. Mamta, did you want to add?
Yeah, you know, I think, yeah, I was thinking of several things, but also I think the next part of that question is how is that understanding kind of critical to the way in which we think about dismantling the system, the connection between sort of the you know, the settler colonial state and the ongoing sort of imperial wars and dirty wars abroad. And and I think like sometimes there's a disconnect when we talk about like what the domestic warfare in our communities, the occupation by police of, you know, neighborhoods and the occupation of land. It's that same, it's the same state that is also, you know, spending $780 billion a year on in a defense budget, right? And that has like military bases across the world, 800 military bases, actually occupying land, actually, you know, plundering communities for their resources, actually extracting in all these different forms, not just you know, dropping bombs, but literally just invading with corporations, with mining corporations, with commerce, with, you know, capital, and that we really kind of like, it's the same thing that we're dismantling, and like that sort of like connection and solidarity with the global struggle against US imperialism, and like our struggles in our communities are so linked by, you know, by colonialism, by settler colonialism, imperialism, and conquest, and the sort of insatiable like thirst for expansion and you know, and occupation. And kind of having those, really sort of thinking about how we're moving, like how we're holding both those pieces together when we talk about our struggle at home, in the, you know, belly of the beast, right?
Yeah, thank you for that, Mamta. And I did add that and tie that whole question to the chat there for folks to perhaps think about and respond to. Thank
Um,
you, Bea. Go ahead, Matias.
Sorry, I didn't raise my hand or anything. I'm also thinking about how local police agencies get funding through programs like the Urban Area Securities Initiative, and even like get excess military equipment through like the 1033 program. And like these are kind of ways that kind of show these local displacement banishment efforts are overtly tied to the perpetual wars, whether they be to kind of feed and grow this garrison state we kind of have here in the United States, or it could be the fact that both campaigns of violence kind of serve the same master, which is capitalism growth.
Yeah, thank you for that. Additional comments, thoughts? Mohammed adds that the Urban Area Security Initiative direct funding to police departments from DHS through FEMA. Thank you. Okay, so I think we can, and I see it is past 7. I think we can go ahead and there were 2 other programs or tactics that we wanted to talk about. Sabrina, I'll go ahead and hand it to you if you want to talk a little bit more about what was crime prevention through environmental design.
Yeah, that last section was a really great conversation. So thanks everyone for jumping in and joining. So crime prevention through environmental design, it's also kind of referred to as design out crime. So the goal of this program, and it kind of does fall under some of the data-driven policing, the goal is to install or remove physical and natural structures in order to facilitate policing and surveillance. So essentially, you're changing the environment to help police surveil the community more efficiently. And of course, prioritizing this program would prioritize policing and surveillance over community needs. So some examples of this would include like removing trees, so police could surveil a park easier, or maybe it was covering some buildings within a housing project that they wanted to watch more often. They didn't want to have to get out of their cars because that took more time. They wanted to be able to drive down the street and have a clear view of the neighborhood that was unobstructed. And so through this program, they could justify the removal of like trees in a neighborhood. And so let's see. So essentially, this continues to create like environmental problems for the neighborhood. We already know that removing green spaces is inherently bad for the neighborhood and how it's more likely to affect brown and Black communities negatively. And so there's been a lot of conversation about this in different communities, and how essentially kind of bring it back to police will justify changing the environment and kind of maybe making the neighborhoods less nice for the convenience of their surveillance. Let's see. Yeah, so does anybody have any ideas or anything else, any questions they have about that?
Yeah, and I know one question we had for folks was like sometimes when we talk about crime prevention through environmental design, folks kind of understand it as something that they have, that they recognize from their own neighborhood, like especially in terms of, like, I think one of the ones that's most recognizable is police cutting back trees for surveillance or removing trees. A common one is cutting back the trees for so the cameras can have a better view. So it's this idea that communities are safer if police and community in general have these direct lines of vision by which they can see, into and around places, and you're removing any potential hiding spots. So things like that. So a question for folks might be like, yeah, is that something that you've heard of in your community, or that sounds familiar? And some of the additional tactics would be adding dividers, adding fences, adding surveillance cameras, lighting, just all these types of things that are ways that police are adding control, containment to areas, putting all these restrictions on areas. So, and if folks, we do have a quote from the report that, did you want to?
Yeah, like Nick
Sorry.
mentioned, oh yeah, I was exactly just reading it. Like Nick mentioned, speed bumps as well, right? So that's going to affect how people are driving through the community, how people are able to move through their own community, and really it's going to be justifying how police can control the community as well. Yeah, Steve also added a really great one. Please also consider newer communities that were built with that clear intention. Walled communities in OC, street design in Irvine, UCI campus are all put together with this policing intent, and they call it safety.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like there are different ways that, oh, and I see Hamid, you have your hand raised. I think you should just go ahead.
I'll wait for Nina. I think Nina had their hand up before I did.
I'm sorry, Nia, I didn't see your hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I thought it was really, well, what I thought was interesting was even with the fencing, it was like certain types of fence were the ones that were recommended for the crime prevention through environmental design. So it wasn't necessarily like any wall would be sufficient, but they were like at least for the LAPD, and I'm not sure if that's the case for every police department, but they requested specifically the fences that you'd be able to see folks from the side. So even within surveillance, the fear that like the wall would prevent the cameras or surveillance from being able to capture everything. And so like even those specific recommendations were very specific in terms of like making sure that from all angles they're able to gather that information and gather that data.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hamid.
Yeah, and I think as we are talking about it, it's also, and this was something that way earlier on, we had written something back in 2012 about this too. Now thinking back those many years, around that how the whole urban geography is mapped out and how policing is so deep into the development process, not only about the conspiracies that go on between them and real estate developers, but the actual construction of it. And one of really our mentor in that, and has done a lot of work in the past, Professor Jackie Levitz, who was a professor of urban planning and public policy at UCLA, really guided us in understanding that and the example she would use, it would be of LA Live, and how the whole development of LA Live, that while it is being projected as an entertainment area, but policing was the primary focus. Including, and I don't have the exact documentation for that, but including recognizing that during uprisings, how people can be kettled in some of these areas as well. So it's not only the street lights or the porch designs or the doors that look outside or the windows that look outside. And then as Nina was sharing about the removal of trees and green spaces, but even thinking ahead about crowd control and various other things as well. So yeah, I mean, this is a tactic that goes back like several decades now in kind of controlling, and I'm glad that it was lifted, that how it impacts, especially in the summertime, that how heat rises from asphalt. I mean, we are based out of Skid Row. That's our community as well. So when you see that there's complete clear cutting that has happened in South Central Los Angeles, it's almost like hardly any. So that's even a more multiplier effect of an ecological impact on the communities too. And Tiff, you had also looked at one point Jordan Downs, And then we had seen that too, that in public housing projects, how they want to have that whole panopticon 360-degree impact effect for surveillance.
Yeah, those are great points, Hamid. Thank you. Yeah, and something that was raised like by community members in Jordan Downs was just like, the calming and healing effect of green spaces, and all of the things that the green spaces do offer communities, of course, including shade and including there are many reasons why we like green spaces. And this is something that was being denied to communities. And of course, it's like we see all the ways that police are wanting to experiment with different ways of so-called reducing crime, but not in terms of like, what are these ways that we know that have positive effects on folks and that have healing effects on folks. And that's not something that they're willing to experiment on, of course. But yeah, those are great points. I'm sorry, Sabrina, did you?
Yeah, no, you're good. I think you guys are doing a great job kind of adding some more context to it. One of the other more recent controversies that we had kind of discussed before as well is how the city, now that they're being critiqued for removing all the trees and green spaces, the city now has to spend money on replanting these spaces or adding back more trees, and kind of just the hypocrisy between different programs between the city versus the police, and how some programs say that they want to maybe help out the community a little bit more. They want to go back and plant trees. They want to go back and like revitalize some of these areas. And yet to some extent, the police are still going to be pushing back because it interferes with their surveillance. And so there's always going to kind of be this pull from the police to continue these programs, of course, because they want their job to be easier. Sorry, Mamta, I saw you had your hand up a little while ago.
Yeah, no, I think I was just wanted to add, when we're talking about sort of, cutting down trees to surveil, it makes me think about all these drug arrests that they have, especially in the Tenderloin, right, where it's just a very, heavily policed area. But most of them that are either by bus, right, where they pretend to be, someone on the street looking for drugs to buy. And the other is like these observed sales. And so literally the cops, like a bunch of them participate in this operation. They will hide somewhere with binoculars and just like spy on people, just surveil people to see, if they can observe a sale. And to do that, they mount themselves in all these places that they, keep secret. But like in order to do that, they have to like cut down the trees and make it like literally make it, easier for them to surveil with their like binoculars on people on the street who may be, just to catch them like, so, some street level drug sale. And that's sort of how they spend the majority of their time, actually. So yeah, it just made me think of that and how kind of bizarre it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just kind of feel odd to prioritize the police over things that the community asks for year after year after year. And the community is continually denied all of this, despite the fact that the city, should be fulfilling those requests. We did have a quote that we wanted to share. Was that also in some of the slides that you had me?
Yeah, I believe.
I think you muted yourself, Nee. Oh.
Sorry, yeah, it's, I can have it up.
Yeah, we see it. Thank you. Does anybody want to read this quote? Thank you,
I'm happy
Mati.
to.
Whichever, I think both Matios and Claire.
You can go ahead, Claire, if you'd like.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. A community organizer who worked in the Pueblo del Rio public housing complex told us that residents had years ago convened walkthroughs with city officials to recommend some of the same proposals for crosswalks and curb cuts that now show up in LAPD's new CPTED assessments. At the time, these proposals were denied or ignored, the city officials citing costs or other excuses. But now LAPD sweeps in to propose delivering these same solutions via the institution of policing.
So this quote is just kind of touching on some of the more recent developments. So more through the current reforms of community policing versus the data-driven policing. So the police are supposed to be coming in and helping out the community. And under that program, they're now bringing in and helping out the community with all the things they've been asking for year after year after year. And it's just kind of a change in tactics, right? They're not necessarily surveilling any less, they're just kind of doing it differently. And they're doing it under the guise of supporting the community by bringing back the trees, by putting in those crosswalks and the curb cuts and all of that, even though for years there was supposedly no budget for any of this. Does anybody have any maybe other examples if they've seen any of that in their communities more recently, where all of a sudden there's like these new changes, these new projects happening, maybe like a revitalization of the community? Thanks, Hamid. Go ahead.
Sorry to take so much space if nobody else is making a comment. Yeah, this is actually something that we filed for public records for all their public housing projects in Los Angeles, and all 10 of them, 10 or 11 of them. And it was interesting that the information, and this is the information similar to this that we got back from them, is exactly what people had been asking forever. And it cuts across all of them, whether it's Jordan Downs or Nickerson Gardens or Pueblo del Rio, or what have you, that each one of them stated basically saying that, that people had been asking for these things, but now, they said we don't have a budget, as you were saying. So I think the point I'm trying to get to is that this is now they are really lifting and amping up this community safety partnership program and community policing, which is really counterinsurgency like occupying armies do. So just like armed social workers and creating that dependency, and kind of just like, that it's become so coercive that it is when we feel is right for you, we will do that. So you may be harmed as a result of that. We don't really give an F, but it is really up to us. So it's that whole power dynamic that is constantly at play as well.
Thank you, Hamid. Yeah, I think those are all some really great points. And hold on, there was just something in the chat. Nick also mentioned portable police cameras in parking lots. Yeah, so there'll always just kind of be a continual reform of how people are being surveillanced and how people are being watched, and a reform in policing tactics, and they're still going to be there. If there are no other comments on this, any other questions? We just have one more section to cover after this.
Yeah, thank you, Sabrina. And there we go. That was my question. Yeah, so thanks for hanging in there with us, folks. We just have one more tactic that we wanted to talk about this evening. And again, this has all been kind of a review of section 2 of the report, where we're kind of going over what are some of the, looking into get more understanding about the nature of some of the particular policing programs and tactics that are being, that have been developed here in LA and that are being used in LA, because in the next few sections, we're going to be looking at the application of them even more deeply. So this is kind of just like laying some of that groundwork, and just the last one that we'll cover tonight, and we'll just kind of get into the basics of, and then we're going to be looking at it in more detail in the next section. That's right, Mamta, isn't that correct? The CNAP is the CNAP, yeah. So we can look forward to further discussion on CNAP in the next section as well. But yeah, so the CNAP is a policing tactic. This stands for, sorry, I just have to clear my throat. Okay, so CNAP is the Citywide Nuisance Abatement Program. I'm sure some folks are already familiar with this, but this is a way that a person, it's another way that a person or a location can be targeted by the city and by police, and forcibly evicted or removed from an area. So CNAP is a collaboration between LAPD and the city attorney's office, as well as a collaboration between, excuse me, the Department of Building and Safety, the Department of Housing and Community Investment, and also the Department of City Planning. So it's like it's a task force of those 5 departments. So that's kind of the core of that team. But it does, when a location, or, and I say person because people live at locations, of course, or exist at locations. When a location or a person is targeted in that way, it can also involve additional actors. There can be, for instance, there may be a community member that is spying on or reporting on someone in the neighborhood. So there are different people that are involved in that process. And essentially, this is the act of having a location deemed to be a nuisance location, so that the city orders an eviction or orders changes to the location. So how that works is a property is reported to the city attorney's office, and they can be reported by police, by a community member, or members of any of those offices that are involved. And at that point, the city attorney then looks at any previous reports that they've had about that location, and then sends a report to the County Board of Supervisors to get approval to open a case on either the tenant or the landlord at that location. So it's essentially the reporting of a location for being a nuisance or being a potential nuisance. And then the city attorney gathers any information that they have about it and sends that to the County Board of Supervisors. The property owner at that point is ordered to make changes to the location, or to make improvements essentially within a certain amount of time, a very short amount of time. And they can be forced by the court to comply. They can face very high fees or fines. And ultimately, the city can order that a location is shut down. So this is something that is used to attack an area and also to justify surveillance with the intent of removing a person, or kind of, as we said, with the crime prevention through environmental design, adding controls to an area, finding ways to add restrictions or surveillance to an area. So I'll just pause and see if folks have comments or questions on that. And Mamta, just check also that I explained that correctly. Okay, getting a nod. But yeah, this is something that that is used in Los Angeles, but also other cities as well. Claire, you want to go ahead? Claire, you might be muted.
I am again, two times in a row. I'm wondering if you have any history on this program or insight into where it came from, because the types of I've also like seen, I've read about this program on the city attorney's office's website. They like brag about it as similar to like community policing. Like we've got little prosecutors in the neighborhood and it's so great and close to the neighborhood. But everything that you've described, like that's already illegal. And why do they need a new program and new laws to go after a nuisance or a tenant? It just seems like an additional way to surveil folks when if something was really wrong in this sort of neutral sounding nuisance or environmental issue way, like there's already a law that covers that. I'm not sure if that question made any sense.
Can folks hear me okay? Sorry, I think I froze for a moment there. Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead, Mamta, I see you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert in this, but I think one of the ways in which this is like sort of really sinister is this sort of blurring between criminal and civil enforcement. And so, and I think in one of the manuals they even bragged about this, and I don't know if it was in reference to like the civil gang injunctions or the nuisance abatements or the nuisance injunctions, but you don't have a right to an attorney, right, in a civil proceeding, which you do in a criminal proceeding. So that's one way in which the city can actually leverage civil law and civil litigation, civil lawsuits to either, people will either default or not have the money to sort of really oppose whatever is being, alleged as to their conduct. And then I think that's exactly right. Like there is this like expansion, this net widening of through civil enforcement of these laws that are criminalized, and we've kind of seen these in other situations as well, right, where especially the use of public nuisance laws to abate the nuisance of folks who are unhoused under whatever, sleeping on the street or open air drug dealing that like we saw in San Francisco or in Sacramento. So yeah, these are increasingly being used as tools of law enforcement. So it's kind of my thought on that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mamta. And Hamid makes a few points in the chat as well, reminding us that CNAP was also a key tactic in designing anchor points. So yeah, that was for myself, the first time I heard of what a CNAP was an understanding that with Operation Laser, the way they targeted locations, one of the tactics that they literally had on their own documents as to how are cops supposed to be disrupting or interrupting crime at a location was to try using a CNAP on the area, that was one of the different tactics that they could use. And that was how we started learning, just a small group of us, I'm sure additional folks already knew about this program very widely, started learning about it in connection with Operation Laser, that was a way that folks are being targeted. And then also Hamid adds that the current iteration of CNAP started in the mid-1990s under LA Rocky Delgado, who was a city attorney at the time.
I'm sorry, the LA piece is just miswriting.
Yeah, thank you for that, folks. Okay, so, and I think the last thing is we'll just share, we had the final quote from the report kind of just highlighting this about like what the CNAP is. So kind of summing that up. Nia, if you're able to share that. Thank you. And this is a bit of a long one. Do we have anyone to read our final excerpt of the evening? Go for it, Matios.
Thanks. Oh, okay. Not only is CNAP another way the city weaponizes police data, it also helps expand LAPD surveillance architecture. The city attorney uses CNAP to require that residential landlords allow for LAPD walkthroughs and patrols, as well as warrantless and keyless 24/7 access. CNAP prosecutors have also required buildings to hire private security who coordinate with police to screen visitors and check identification. Excluding and banishing people's family and associates, as well as enforce coercive rules on how people can spend time or gather in common areas. For residents, all of this can amount to a takeover of their homes by police, bringing the violence of broken windows and policing and stop and frisk right onto people's doorsteps, all under the threat of eviction.
Yeah, thank you for that, Matios. Matias, I assume your hand is just still raised from the reading. Is that right?
It is, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. And welcome, Carla. We're just looking at the final topic of our night, which we're talking about the citywide nuisance abatement program. So I don't know if folks have any thoughts on this passage. Or if this is something that folks have experienced themselves and you'd be willing to share about that. And just there's a lot here. I mean, in terms of like when we're talking about data-driven policing and how it fits in with the citywide nuisance abatement program, one of the things that we understand is how data-driven policing is used to gather information on locations. So like one of the ways that, for instance, a cop can provide evidence of a location being a nuisance, and something that we have a few examples about in the report is, yeah, so essentially if you want to have a property deemed a nuisance, a person can gather information on it or direct a cop to be gathering information on it. And that can just look like posting up outside that residence and gathering surveillance of people coming and going, putting up automated license plate readers. That was something that they would actually do under Operation Laser. That's something that police have described, that they would just put automatic license plate readers around a home and just keep track of all the coming and going, and then try to kind of build a case around that. So these very targeted assaults on people's homes, just with the purpose of gathering enough data to be able to make this case that this is a nuisance location, or just make that threat of eviction that would perhaps cause someone to leave the area. And I see question, does an LAPD walkthrough mean access to apartments or public areas only? Let's see.
It would likely mean just public areas only. I used to do social work in like the Hyde Park, Inglewood area, in some of those buildings where a lot of my clients lived. And quite a few of the bigger buildings would have police would have access to just kind of walk through the neighborhood or walk through the building if they had to. And some of the landlords would give them access to cameras as needed.
Yeah, thank you for that. Additional questions or comments? I know it's about time for us to be wrapping up. Nick says crime is profitable for the economy. The objective of law enforcement is suppression of dissent and very profitable incarceration of minorities. Yes. Okay, and I think it's about that time. Thank you so much as well, Claire. I think it's about that time that we can start wrapping up. Unless anyone has additional comments or questions. And then I see another comment from Steve. You say, especially in this time and place, it seems many of these programs sponsored by the authorities or police can lead to vigilantisms. Seen some early evidence of this in homeless sweeps put together by local group in Long Beach. Yeah, I don't know if you want to say any more about that, Steve.
Yeah, I can. I went to a city council meeting or a representative, and there was a group of folks, East End, Long Beach, the more affluent end, and we're looking at their term, the homeless situation, and putting together groups of people to monitor and track. Essentially, they were building a vigilante group that then council candidate in Long Beach was, and you'd have to assume this kind of shenanigans is going on in other locales, particularly in transitional places where there is some butting up against more affluent communities. I'm sure it's going on, but I'm curious on others' perspective on this. I think it's really problematic, frankly.
Yeah, I see Carla adding a comment to that as well. And you're welcome to say that out loud if you like, Carla. Enforcement policy emboldens white supremacists and vigilantes. They work hand in hand, and criminalization allows them to work together in public. Yeah, these are great points. And unfortunately, we are, I think, reaching that time that we do want to be, that's right. Yeah, Hamid says local residents installing license plate readers. I mean, it's definitely something that we see kind of being openly encouraged. People taking that upon themselves to be doing this surveillance in their own communities, especially against people that they deem to be criminal.
That also reminds me of how Ring, the home camera systems, have partnered with police agencies and essentially kind of given them easier access to footage that I think most people would ordinarily think is private footage, since it's footage from their cameras on their home porches, right? These are like the doorbell cameras. And all of that surveillance and all of those recordings seem to be more or less uploaded to a larger database that can then be requested by police agencies.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. And Hannah says these license plate readers are now going up in Nashville, where I'm from, despite all the dissent from communities. Yeah, it's definitely a concern, and it makes me just think about the importance of us to be, talking with our neighbors and to be building those relationships with folks, so that we are, in that position to be having those conversations about surveillance in these in our neighborhoods, and about who is harmed by that. But I think So I think I'm not really seeing any more comments or questions. So I think we can start wrapping it up. But this has been a really great conversation, folks. And yeah, definitely. I know that we didn't share the notes from the last time, but we will have those uploaded onto the website prior to the beginning of the next conversation, in which we start looking at section 3. And Nick's comment says LA needs an OC of resistance attitude without OC racism. Yeah. We do hope that that folks will be able to join us. Sabrina, did you have any closing comments or anything that I forgot to cover?
I don't think so. I think it was a pretty thorough conversation. So thank you everybody who joined in and kind of gave some extra information and their perspectives as well.
Anything, Hamid, any final comments or?
Oh, just about our next, I don't know if you wrapped up, I'm going to announce next Tuesday's webinar.
Thanks.
Will be on gender and sexuality. And also we have, we can place the, I don't know if Martios or Nina, if you have that link handy, that we are also reaching out to folks that if they want to have a reading group in their local community, please let us know. There's a little Google link, Google Doc, and we'd be happy to support. We've had some of the groups who've been doing that as well. And then really happy to announce that if folks want to mark their calendar, February 11th at 5 p.m., no, 4 p.m. LA time, Haymarket Books has invited us for members to have a conversation with Mike Davis on the report as well. People know Mike Davis has done incredible work around documenting. I mean, one of my favorite scholars who has documented so much stuff. And it will be a conversation between Mike Davis and our own Shakir, Dejanay Dozier. Dejanay is, they're one of our Hood scholars. They are now assistant professor at Cal State Long Beach. And Steve Diaz, who's an organizer at LA Can, who's lived in Skid Row for the longest time. So it's going to be really an awesome conversation. So excited about it.
Yeah, that sounds great. That's awesome. Any additional announcement from folks? All right. Okay. Well, we hope to see folks soon. And yeah, with this conversation will continue in 2 weeks' time. And we hope to see folks somewhere along the way next time. And Matios also reminds us to sign the petition rejecting the Targeted Violence Terrorism Prevention grant that is headed to LA City Council, which folks can probably find on the coalition website. Is that right, Matios? Oh, and also in our chat, and probably also on the coalition website. Thanks so much, folks. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Tiff.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you, Tiff.